What would you actually do if you found out, in your 30s, that hard work alone was never going to be enough to change your life? Would you keep grinding through the same exhausting shift, telling yourself things would eventually get better on their own? Would you keep ignoring your mother's calls because you couldn't stand to tell her nothing had changed? This is the story of a man who worked harder than almost anyone he knew, and still watched his life shrink around him, until a stranger at 3 o'clock in the morning taught him the one thing his years of exhaustion never could. Stay until the end, because the 4 rules this man learned changed everything, and you're going to want to write them down. Comment right now, if someone told you that you already own 1 hour nobody else wants, what would you build with it? Then keep watching, because every single week that follows matters. Elias was 31 years old, and most nights he walked home from the warehouse alone, beneath pale moonlight, through a sleeping town that never seemed to notice him arrive or leave. He worked the night shift loading heavy wooden crates under harsh fluorescent light, his hands calloused from years of gripping rough shipping boxes, his body moving through the motions of a job he'd stopped thinking about years ago, because thinking about it too closely only made the exhaustion worse. He came home to a cramped rented room with cracked walls and worn furniture, sat alone at a small kitchen table most nights eating a simple meal beneath a single hanging light bulb, and stared at unpaid bills scattered in front of him like a puzzle he already knew he couldn't solve. His phone rang sometimes, his mother's name lighting up the screen, and more often than he wanted to admit, he let it ring out and watched the call end before setting the phone face down on the table, because he didn't know how to tell her that nothing was different this year than it had been the year before. Days blurred into identical mornings. He lay awake in his narrow bed listening to the hum of the laundromat below his room, wondering, in the quiet way a man wonders about something he stopped expecting an answer to, why hard work never seemed to change his circumstances. A symbolic kind of sameness had settled over his life, sunrise fading into another identical day, co-workers moving hurriedly around him while he quietly disappeared into routine, worn smooth by the sheer repetition of it. He'd stand on the loading dock some mornings and stare at a sunrise he barely noticed anymore, the kind of beautiful thing a tired man stops being able to see. Then winter came, and it got worse. The warehouse owner gathered the workers together beneath the cold fluorescent lights one evening and announced, without much ceremony, that hours were being cut. Elias listened quietly as his already limited shifts shrank further, and watched 2 younger workers start their first day at lower wages while he stood across the room saying nothing at all. He understood, without needing it explained to him, that he had quietly become replaceable. He walked home that night through falling snow, fists clenched, swallowing something that tasted like humiliation, his breath forming pale clouds in the freezing air as the frustration grew heavier with every step. He paused once beside a frozen river and asked himself, honestly, whether his future was ever going to look any different than this, and the sleeping town stretched out silently around him, and he had never in his life felt smaller. His shadow stood alone beneath a street lamp in the winter dark, and he thought about every sacrifice he'd made that still, somehow, seemed to have led nowhere at all. It was precisely 3 o'clock in the morning when Elias turned the corner toward home and noticed, for the first time in all the nights he'd walked this same path, a warm golden light glowing through a frosted window. He'd passed this bakery 100 times without seeing it. He stopped walking. Through the glass, an elderly baker stood kneading dough beneath a single hanging bulb, working peacefully 3 full hours before the rest of the world would even think about waking up. The contrast between the old man's quiet purpose and Elias's own exhaustion held him motionless on the sidewalk. Snow fell gently around him, while golden light spilled from the doorway into the frozen street, and something about the stillness of that hour, a stillness he'd never once noticed belonged to anyone, pulled a quiet curiosity out of him he hadn't felt in a long time. He stepped closer to the window, and then, with more uncertainty than he expected to feel over something so small, he raised his hand and knocked. The door opened, and warm light spilled out across the frozen sidewalk. The old baker looked at him and smiled, kindly, the way you'd smile at someone you'd been expecting, though of course he hadn't been. His name was Tomas. He didn't ask any questions. He simply stepped aside and gestured for Elias to come in out of the cold. Inside, the bakery was warm and quiet, except for the steady rhythm of dough being kneaded. Tomas poured him a cup of black coffee, steam curling up off it in the golden light, and Elias sat on a wooden stool near the ovens and watched the old man work. "You look," Tomas said eventually, not unkindly, "like a man who just received terrible news." And maybe it was the hour, or the coffee, or the simple fact that no one had asked him a real question in longer than he could remember, but Elias started talking. For the first time in months, he told someone the truth. He told Tomas about the cut hours, about the 2 younger men hired to replace him without anyone saying so out loud. He told him about the bills piling up on his kitchen table. His voice shook when he admitted he hadn't answered his mother's calls in weeks, because he was ashamed of having nothing good to tell her. He told him he was starting to believe that hard work alone might never be enough to change anything, that he was trapped in the same exhausting cycle, repeating endlessly, going nowhere. The coffee went cold in his hands as the story ran out of itself. Tomas had listened without interrupting the entire time, his weathered hands never stopping their steady kneading. When the silence settled, he finally looked up. "May I share something with you?" he asked. Elias nodded, too tired to refuse wisdom from a stranger, even one who owed him nothing. "Working hard," Tomas said, "has never actually been your problem. You already work harder than many wealthy men I have known in my lifetime." Elias frowned, not understanding. Tomas continued anyway. "Every single hour of your hard work currently belongs to somebody else's clock." When Elias protested, quietly, that he had to work, that people depended on him, that survival demanded sacrifice, Tomas nodded, agreeing with all of it, none of it in dispute. And then he asked a different question entirely. "What time do you wake up?" he said, "because you personally choose to." Elias opened his mouth to answer, and realized, in the silence that followed, that he genuinely did not know. Every hour of his life, he understood suddenly, had always belonged to someone else. Alarm clocks, warehouse schedules, exhaustion itself, quietly dictating the shape of his days. Tomas wiped flour from his hands onto his apron and told him a story of his own. 41 years earlier, he said, he had lived a life remarkably similar to this one, balancing 2 difficult jobs, quietly watching his marriage come apart at the seams from sheer exhaustion. A mentor of his, back then, had told him something that changed how he understood time itself for the rest of his life, and Tomas repeated it slowly now, the way he must have repeated it to himself 10,000 times over the decades since. "The rich do not have more hours than you do. They simply own the hours nobody else wants." He gestured toward the frosted window, toward the sleeping town beyond it, bathed in moonlight. Nobody, he explained, was asking anything of the hours before dawn. No employer competed for them. No bill, no obligation, no ringing phone. While the world slept, daylight was endlessly claimed by other people's demands, but 3 o'clock in the morning sat there, forgotten, untouched, belonging to whoever was willing to show up for it. Almost nobody fought to possess it. Elias listened, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that felt distantly like hope moved behind his tired eyes. "So waking up earlier," Elias asked, skeptical, "could really change my whole life?" Tomas laughed, warmly. "Nothing about 3 o'clock itself was magical," he said. "The real power was simply in finally building something, using hours nobody else could ever take from him." He raised one flour-dusted finger. "Rule 1, he said. "Wake at 3 o'clock every single morning, without negotiating with yourself when the alarm sounds. The moment it becomes optional, comfort will always win." A second finger rose. "Rule 2, the first 90 minutes belong entirely to one meaningful project. Not 10, 1. Many hard-working people stay poor their whole lives because they try to build everything at once and finish nothing." A third finger. "Rule 3. During those 90 minutes, comparison is forbidden completely. No phones, no news, no measuring your beginning against someone else's destination. Ambition dies quietly the moment it starts admiring somebody else's progress instead of building its own. And finally, a fourth finger, the most difficult rule of all. Rule 4. Protect this hour exactly the way a starving man protects his last piece of bread. Offer no apologies to anyone unwilling to understand what you're quietly building before dawn. Tomas told him 90 days was all he was asking for. Nothing more, nothing less. 90 mornings, he said, were enough to become an entirely different man, without needing to become a different person. Elias, with quiet vulnerability, asked the only question that felt honest. What happens, he said, if absolutely nothing changes after 90 difficult mornings? Tomas smiled and returned his hands to the dough. Failure while building your own future, he said, is still more meaningful than succeeding inside somebody else's plan. And then he asked him plainly which burden he would rather carry 20 years from now. The first faint colors of sunrise were beginning to show through the frosted windows. Elias left the warm bakery carrying Tomas's empty coffee cup and walked home through the quiet snow, turning every word over in his mind. For the first time in years, he didn't collapse straight into exhausted sleep. He sat at the small table in his rented room, staring at a blank page, and for nearly an hour he tried to answer a question he had never once asked himself. What did he actually love doing, more than anything else? A memory surfaced, unbidden, of himself as a boy, rebuilding his uncle's broken lawnmower piece by piece in the summer sun, grinning with pride. Another memory followed, of taking apart household appliances, just for the joy of understanding how they worked. He realized, slowly, that repairing machines had always brought him a kind of peace and purpose he'd never once let himself take seriously. He picked up the pen and wrote 4 words on the page: small engine repair. He smiled, faintly, a sense of possibility, returning to his tired face for the first time in longer than he could remember, and set Tomas's empty cup down beside the paper. That evening, before another warehouse shift, he bought a simple alarm clock. He set it for exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, and lay awake that night wondering whether 90 sacred mornings could really be enough to change his destiny, uncertainty, and hope wrestling quietly inside his chest. He didn't touch the alarm. He let it stand. The first morning was brutal. Every aching muscle in his body begged him to stay under the blanket and forget the whole idea existed. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, debating whether his new life should start today or some other day, and then he remembered Tomas's voice, telling him never to negotiate once the alarm sounds. He rose. He made instant coffee and set it beside Tomas's empty cup, opened an old library book on small engine repair, and studied the grainy diagrams before the sun came up. 90 unbroken minutes later, he smiled, quietly proud of something that belonged entirely to him, and went back to bed before another long shift. The second morning was worse. Half asleep, he silenced the alarm and fell straight back into exhausted sleep, waking at noon with a sharp, quiet disappointment. The third morning brought the same defeat. He pictured it, some nights, like grains of sand slipping through his open hands. But instead of giving up entirely, he simply reset the alarm and tried again. By the 5th morning, he rose immediately, despite every protest his body offered. By the end of the first week, exhaustion still followed him everywhere, but he had begun discovering a strange peace hidden inside the stillness surrounding 3 o'clock. He pulled a broken desk fan out from beside a dumpster behind his building and took it apart on his kitchen table, sketching what he learned in a notebook, slowly beginning to understand how machines speak through their failures. By the second week, the alarm no longer felt like punishment. It started to feel like an invitation. He began waking moments before it even sounded. By day 21, discipline had quietly started replacing motivation altogether, and by the 3rd week, protecting the sacred hour had become easier than surrendering it. His table filled slowly with notebooks and repaired parts. He fixed a small household appliance a neighbor had thrown away, and felt genuine pride return to him after years of believing it had left for good. But the exhausting warehouse shifts never let up, and the toll of both lives running at once began to show. dark circles deepening beneath his eyes as he struggled to stay upright, lifting crates through the night. Then, one freezing morning, working a little too intensely on the rusted casing of an old engine, the metal slipped beneath his grip and sliced deep across his hand. He stared at the blood on the wooden table in shocked silence, wrapped it in a towel, and fought back the disappointment rising in his chest. Hours later he sat in a crowded free clinic, waiting for 6 stitches, discouragement settling heavy over him as morning sunlight filtered weakly through the window. At the warehouse that evening, a coworker noticed the bandages and laughed, asking, lightly, whether Elias was planning to become a mechanic instead of sleeping these days. It was said carelessly, but it wounded him more than the cut itself had. That night, rain tapping against his window, Elias sat staring at Tomas's empty coffee cup, wondering quietly whether people like him were simply never meant to have more than survival. He remembered the old baker's question about which failure he'd rather carry for the rest of his life. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the alarm clock and set it again for 3 o'clock. He woke at 2:58, before the alarm ever had the chance to sound. Unable to work with his injured hand, he opened a worn book of wiring diagrams instead, turning each page carefully with the one hand he had left, refusing to surrender the only hour that had ever truly belonged to him. Somewhere in that quiet, one-handed persistence, he understood, for the first time, that progress is sometimes measured simply by showing up again. By day 45, his hand had healed, and he returned fully to the sacred ritual. He repaired a neighbor's broken portable generator, listening as the engine came back to life beneath his hands, and the grateful neighbor pressed a crumpled $20 bill into his palm. Elias stood in the driveway staring at it. For the first time in his life, he had earned money from something he had chosen, deliberately, to build for himself. He folded the bill carefully into his worn wallet and wrote, that evening, in his growing notebook, first repair, $20. By day 50, neighbors started quietly bringing him small repairs before sunrise. By day 60, he was completing 2 or 3 jobs a week before ever reporting for his warehouse shift, his once empty notebook now overflowing with sketches and plans. By day 75, he had saved enough to buy his first real set of tools and arranged each one in the polished metal toolbox like something sacred finally finding its place. By day 80, the repair work was earning him more each month than he had ever thought possible. And as day 90 approached, for the first time in years, Elias found that he no longer feared tomorrow because he had finally started building it himself. He returned to the bakery in the early morning light, stood in the doorway, and smiled. 90 days, he said. I did it. No negotiating. Tomas paused and smiled the particular smile of a man who had watched this exact moment happen many times before and still treasured every single one. He asked only one question. Elias answered it gratefully, that he finally owned something nobody had handed him and nobody could take away. Tomas explained, gently kneading dough beneath the same hanging lamp, that this journey had never really been about the money at all. It had always been about reclaiming ownership of his own time. One protected hour, faithfully guarded each morning, had quietly become the foundation for everything else that followed. Elias thought back to the frightened stranger who had knocked on this door 90 mornings earlier, and understood, finally, that 3 o'clock had never been magical in itself. It had simply become the hour he chose for himself. He thanked Tomas, sincerely, for giving him something worth more than advice, the courage to begin. Outside, the first golden light of sunrise spread across the quiet streets, and Elias walked home knowing, for the first time in a long time, that he wasn't walking toward survival alone anymore. My friend, Elias's story was never really about waking up early. It was about reclaiming the hours nobody else ever noticed were waiting for him. Millions of people wake up early every single day and remain exactly where they started, because they hand those sacred, quiet moments straight back to distraction the second they open their eyes. The real transformation only begins the moment one protected hour becomes something entirely, unapologetically your own. Think for a moment about your own 3 o'clock. Not literally, necessarily, but the hour in your day that nobody is currently asking anything of, the hour you've been handing over to your phone, or to exhaustion, or to nothing at all. What would you build if you protected it the way Elias learned to protect his? Remember what Tomas told him. The rich don't have more hours than you do. They simply own the hours nobody else wants. So here's your challenge, the same one Tomas gave a stranger standing outside his bakery in the snow. Pick one thing, today, that you've been meaning to build. Just one, not 10. Find 1 hour this week where nobody is asking anything of you, and protect it completely, without negotiating with yourself when it's hard. Comment below, right now, and tell me honestly what your one thing is, the project you'd finally build if you stopped scattering 90 minutes across everything and started giving it to just one. I read every single comment, and if this story reminded you of your own quiet 3 o'clock, waiting patiently and unclaimed, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week I bring you another true story of someone who finally decided their hours were worth owning. Someday, remember, was never a date sitting on a calendar. It was always just the day somebody finally stopped waiting for one. Elias found his day at 3 o'clock in the morning, outside a bakery he had walked past 100 times without ever once seeing. You don't need a bakery, or a baker, or a snowy street. You just need to decide, the way he finally did, that the next quiet hour nobody else wants is going to belong to you instead.